Until I played this game, I didn't really know anything about the Ponziani opening. This is a 5-minute game. I was black. Let's have a look. E4, E5, knight F3, knight F6, and the move C3 introduces us to the Ponziani opening. I thought of a couple of responses here that are very natural. The one I played is D5. But let's have a look at knight to f6. It seems like a natural move to attack the e-pawn because white doesn't have knight to c3 to defend it. After knight f6, a couple ways white could play. He could play it slowly by playing d3, d5, knight bd7, and this is exactly a Philidor defense with the colors reversed. And so white has an extra tempo in the Philidor, and a very good move used on the extra tempo, c3, controlling these squares, opening this diagonal. So I didn't really want this kind of a position as black. The Philidor itself is not that bad, and to give it an extra tempo, I just didn't like it. Another way for white to play is more quickly with d4. And you can play a really sharp line here. You can take on e4, and the most common response is d5 attacking the c6 knight. And I noticed in the database this knight is most often moved to e7, but sometimes it actually retreats to b8. And there's another very sharp move you can play. You can sacrifice the knight and play bishop to c5. And the point is, if white takes the knight, you're going to drive the king out into the open. And then you're going to get your pieces out fast and attack. So that's a possibility. In fact, the engine sort of likes that. But going back, you can move the knight. I think it's probably best to move it to e7, and this is how white recovers his pawn. And then you can play knight to g6, and knight takes knight, h takes g6, and get an open file for your rook. Material's equal, and I think the position is okay for black. All right, so going back to the game, instead of knight to f6, I decided to play d5. This reminds me of the c3 Sicilian, the Aleopan Sicilian, which runs like this. And when white plays c3, again, black has two main lines here, knight to f6 and d5, just like the Ponziani. And in the c3 Sicilian, I do like to play d5. White captures the d-pawn, and you get your queen out in the center of the board without fear of losing a tempo to knight to c3. So I decided let's do the same thing against the Ponziani. Let's play d5. And my opponent did take on d5, and I captured back with the queen. But when checking the database after the game, I noticed this move is almost never played e takes d5. Instead, white likes to play queen to a4, pinning the knight and threatening the e5 pawn. And then black will play f6 in this position to support that pawn. And then a couple common moves are d3, which looks passive to me to block in the bishop. I would prefer playing bishop to b5 in this position, attacking the knight a second time. And black does have to keep an eye on his d-pawn, so the best way to defend c6 is with the other knight to keep the queen line open to that pawn. So that's another way the game could have went. But my opponent did take the pawn on d5, and I think the engine says it's already equal or even very slightly in black's favor after recapturing. But then my opponent played a really passive move, d3. I think d4 is a key move to play in the Ponziani in a lot of lines. You do want to strike out in the center. You don't want to block in your light squared bishop. So d3 looked really passive. Now you have this pawn in the way of your knight, and you have this pawn in the way of your bishop. and black's development is very comfortable. Okay, so then I played bishop to f5 to put further pressure on that d3 pawn that's just sitting there with no pawns to guard it. Queen to b3, which attacks my queen and the b7 pawn. So I decided to make a multi-purpose move. Long castles defends both the b7 pawn and the queen and gets the king castled and the rook developed. c4, I think that's a big mistake, just giving up this d4 square. There's a glaring hole in the position now that black can take advantage of at some point. I retreated my queen to e6. I wanted to get it out of the way of my pieces, so it's not in the way of this bishop, it's not in the way of this rook. I thought that was a good square for it. I can also push this pawn and maybe open the e-file at some point. Knight to g5 to attack my queen, but I simply slide it over to g6, which attacks this d3 pawn for a third time. So there are 3 attackers and only 2 defenders on that pawn. And it turns out there's no way to defend the pawn any further. You can't push it or defend it. So white is losing a pawn in this position. Black does have to keep an eye on this f7 square that the knight is threatening though. So my opponent played g3 to get the bishop out since his pawns are blocking it. I took that pawn, and I think this is another mistake, although the position is probably already winning for black. Bishop to h3 check doesn't really do much but deliver a check, and it leaves my bishop in a strong position, preventing my opponent from castling. So maybe trading bishops was better. So king to b8, knight to c3, maybe trying to orchestrate some kind of an attack with these pieces on my castle king. h6 drives the knight away, and then knight to d4. So I attack the queen and the knight and pretty much force my opponent to take my knight, which allows me to open this e-file to the king. And the king cannot castle, so the king's in a lot of danger in this position. My opponent played knight a4. Maybe it's headed towards c5 and attack the b7 square, but there's really no threat here, and that just loses on the spot to queen to e4 check, forking the king and the rook. And my opponent gave me a mate in 1, king to d2, queen to e2 mate. King to d1 would have been a mate in 1 as well. Okay, so I was introduced to the Ponziani in this game, and I'm going to remember my options. So thanks for watching the video.